So welcome, David, and thank you, Sven, for that beautiful film. I realize now upon the second viewing that, excuse me, that really you brought to life an unrealized project, the film, the audio, the aspirations of Bernt and Sigurd. So you finished something that they were not able to. It was a beautiful thing to have done. I've been thinking about, we've had we had a lecture here yesterday, Tosi Oshinawa, who's an architect from Nigeria, and I watched your movie before, and I was preparing for her talk as well, and I was thinking about architects who operate in moments that are between worlds in terms of history. That, I think Sigurd Lewerentz is sometimes described as I think that people may think of him as a modernist architect, but he's a modern architect. I mean, because part of the circumstances in which that he worked was between all the transformations that are mentioned in the movie, and pointing to Sweden in the 1950s and 60s, the impact of industrialization and urbanization on how architecture is produced, the kind of person that you have to be, the kind of organization that you have to participate in to succeed in those circumstances. And that Lewerentz, who strangely enough, was born in a factory, ran a factory, developed standards for industrially produced materials that other architects could spec, ultimately rejected operating in those circumstances. And that, somewhere in the film there's the word hope is mentioned, but I also, when I watched it, I felt sad, because I feel like many of the architects that we often are drawn to are architects who represent a kind of evanescence of possibilities that are less available to us. I mean, his ability to be on site, to craft the building, to interact so personally with the workers that he speaks to us like like us, and that these are things which are hard to accomplish today, and probably in most instances in his world as well. So, without going on, I hope, too long, I will say one other thing, that it's also interesting that, I was thinking about his personality, who he was, what kind of person he was, and how his misfit within the circumstances of that world, but also how that world shaped him. I mean, in my introduction, I referred to him as an enigmatic figure, but it's also a romantic figure, because the romantics were, in a sense, Romanticism is related to the advent of modernity and all the forces that are making the life of individuality, craft and artistry increasingly difficult. Anyway, I think that you portray that well and capture the interaction between those circumstances which are social and personal and architectural. I don't know. I wonder, I'm not posing a question, but a set of reflections, and I wonder if those things struck you, or perhaps David?
Well, thank you. This was amazing, and thank you for letting me have access to the film in advance. There's so many things we can talk about. I mean, imagine this is food for thought for a psychoanalyst to write a whole PhD. So when this past summer I visited in Sweden two of these structures, St. Mark's Church and the cemetery, the Woodlands Cemetery, I was just transfixed. I had never heard of this guy, and suddenly here I'm transported to a very, very different dimension. And then in your documentary, I was really mesmerized by the relationship between Nyberg and Lewerentz. I think Nyberg and it was confirmed. I have actually, if there is time, I can read you. It'll take 4 minutes. A note that one of the historians, Johan Orn, sent me of his study of the relationship between Nyberg and Lewerentz. Nyberg was obsessed with Lewerentz. Nyberg would sneak, apparently, into St. Peter's church during the construction, and almost every day hang out there and observe. I mean, you portray it right more of a collaboration, of a friendship, but there was something also voyeuristic in him initially, something very, in psychoanalytic terms, very perverse, that he wanted to capture something about what this man was doing. And even if you see the filming with the grain, how granular, of course, that was the technicality of the time, the film at the time, but how granular the film appears, and there are takes where almost the face of Lewerentz fuses, the grain of the face fuses almost with the grain of the bricks, no? It is really very interesting, the fusion with the structure. And so Johannes and I have been talking a lot about this obsession, and I learned that he had almost like an itinerary to develop the cult of Lewerentz, and he is held as responsible for that cult. He created almost like a project of many books, apparently, that never saw the light, and apparently there is a prototype of one of the books that Nyberg wanted to create to promote Lewerentz's work. There was a series, but he died. Well, he got ill, he died. But he was criticized by the community of architects for portraying him in a specific way. Specifically, the cigar keeps appearing everywhere. And they said, one architect said, you have to quit presenting this cigar monument. That's how he referred to it. So one point, I don't want to be too verbose and take over too much time, but to say focusing on the relationship between the two of them is very interesting, and you shed some light on it. And lastly, I just want to leave you with one thought. I think that his life is punctuated by a lot of disillusionments, a lot of disappointments. And I think something died and was cremated in the Woodlands Cemetery that led to a different life for him, as if he exists between two lives. One life happened and came to an interruption, so to speak, and he departed, and he then created another persona of himself. And to me, that split is also something really very interesting, and to reflect on that period before the cemetery and after the cemetery, no?
Mm-hmm. I will continue with this. Both of you talking about this archive material and Bernt Nyberg. And as you said, Bernt Nyberg was among a group of people from the same Lund, from the same city, and they were like really seeing Lewerentz coming there like the big hero. Yes. And they were taking a lot of close-up photos, not only Bernt Nyberg, that was like really showing a mystery guy with a smoking cigar with a hat, and he become like a superhero or a rock and roll star about
a cult figure. No?
Yeah, and it was really a smart way to like get out the picture of him as some mysterious person that a lot of stories come around and he get well known, but it was not, of course, the whole picture of him. And that was a lot of people I know nowadays, like by having too much of these pictures, it just led you to one kind of story about Lewerentz, but not the true story. But in the same time, the pictures are really nice. And I wanted to, of course, understand more beyond the myth of Lewerentz and like try to see more about him. And also, I felt that the relationship between them was really a way to get closer to Lewerentz, because he was opening up something for Bernt Nyberg in these interviews. And I felt a lot of respect of like using the material and make a film for the audience about a person that was not interested to be in front of camera and not being public. It was a bit complicated, I would say, in the process. And if I didn't met Mariana Manne, that's in the film, that was also filming together with Bernt Nyberg, I will definitely have another picture of how Lewerentz was, how Bernt Nyberg was, because she was this really open-minded, really free-thinking, artistic woman that was so happy about everything and telling so many weird stories about how Lewerentz was as an old person, how funny they had together, how many parties they went to, and how free they were in thinking. So without her, I think also, like you said, seeing these pictures, I mean, he was taking stills of Lewerentz, like only the face, more or less. It was a feeling like he was into something else, not the person. Like if it was like the material of Lewerentz he was interested in. And he was not only taking picture of it, he was also taking the stills into the lab, and then he was shooting them with a 60mm film camera and filming the stills. And that was part of the film archive I had as well. And that was, in my mind, like having someone taking these extremely stills, you should like standing like this, and then also after that taking them and filming the stills. That's like a creepy person, more or less. But actually they had a good relationship, and they had these nice talks, and they were joking, and they had humor together. So I can't say he was too creepy.
Right. Yes. One question I have for both of you. In terms of atmospheres, the term atmospheric is called, he created atmospheres. I believe that, well, I think that atmospheres cannot be created. Our atmospheres exist, and you can create experiences conducive to capturing the existing atmosphere, but can we control the fact that when I'm walking in the cemetery, the clouds pass by and suddenly it gets dark and changes the atmosphere? It's not within my control to create, to regulate the conditions of the atmosphere. So how do you feel about this idea of atmospheric spaces, or almost this theological emotivism that Juhani Palasma talks about? I have a little bit of difficulty with that. So, because I think the sense of religiousness in those spaces, the sense of spirituality, is drawn from a sense of power that those structures have over us, no? Rather than an architect creating that kind of atmosphere. I don't know, what does this make sense?
You know, I was thinking about the, David, you mentioned the extinguishing of a moment in his life at the end in Woodland Cemetery, and the dramatic difference between the late work and the South Chapel, which is the one with the very tall classical columns, which still belong to a more traditional figurative and symbolic tradition, and that the late work is, very clearly, it's anti-iconic, anti-figurative, and in a way iconoclastic. And I think that, in terms of the myth-making, that this notion of an architecture that disappears in favor of atmosphere is an ultimate expression of the iconoclastic urge. To erase architecture's, I mean, there was a discussion of that he's not pursuing an aesthetic purpose, because the aesthetic purpose is a condemned goal, just like image is condemned. So you favor, like the buildings they're described as being strange. Part of what's strange is they don't seem to present, they don't present themselves. They seem to be the result of, I don't know, unknown forces of materialization. And these are all, I mean, it was the two late projects are churches, and it was a dilemma of modernists and also in particular Protestant churches. What should they look like? What image should they present? So atmosphere is better, but the fact is that the architect must articulate the thing that produces the atmosphere, which is the building. And there's always a paradox, just like, I mean, the description, David, that you provided of, well, actually both of you were talking about, you know, coming in so close to Lewerentz's face, as if to dissolve the face into its substance. And the obsession with this substance of the building is a means, you know, it allows the building to disappear into its material compositions, its physical reality, rather than its image, rather than its, you know, what in other circumstances might be called its aesthetic vocation. So I see, I think that the word atmosphere is a, you know, when we talk about like rhetoric in the language that we use to describe architecture, it's a trick to erase the actual fact that the architect must design the figure and form of the building. And the Berndt's lionization of Sigurd Lewerentz somehow betrays his own wish to disappear. So the representation of Lewerentz in the film, in this iconic clothing and outfit and the cigar, which is also an image of a certain kind of modesty, is parallel to, now it sounds like, you know, I mean, as if all of it were a trick, but a rhetoric of modesty about the buildings. I mean, it's beautiful and compelling. I've been to the buildings, and they are powerful, but they are in fact hard to capture. Yes. But that's not the same, I don't know, I mean, I'm thinking about this word atmosphere. It's not the same thing as atmosphere.
Yeah, atmosphere, I mean, it's, maybe you can put your own ideas what atmosphere is. I think all rooms have an atmosphere, but how do you control it? I see there are a lot of feelings when you enter these dark spaces, because if you don't see that much, you start to imagine things, and of course you see parts and you hear things, and like you are in this room, and there are happening things in your head, and maybe this material is taking you to maybe memories or something that you can't really say exactly what it is, but it's a part of the atmosphere, I would say. And the atmosphere is maybe coming from inside of you as well. Not, and it's hard to say, yes, this architect was doing exactly that to create that kind of atmosphere. I think it's not that easy. It's more another feeling.
And Sven, what was the most difficult thing in this project for you? What was something you really struggled with in this project?
In the earliest period, I think it was to dealing with a person that a lot of people know about and having thoughts about from the beginning, and then I should know a lot about a subject that a lot of people know a lot about, and tell a story that's relevant for me, relevant for a broader audience, and can't be to be conflict with the big knowledge of him already. I was afraid of making mistakes, and if you're afraid, as I say in the film, then you're not free. So that was the problem. But along the process and meeting all these people I met, and in some way, I think, of course, I'm not understanding everything at all and can't explain all, but I get the feeling of him by the archive and by the places, and then I felt it was possible to make the film.
It's striking, though. I mean, I keep thinking about the. I mean, in the movie, the way the effort to the effort to capture the buildings, and I mean, the documentary footage is material you have, but then there is. I mean, some of the footage. Some of it is contemporary, or of the.
Yeah, like 70%, 80%. Yeah, a lot is contemporary.
Right. So how you choose to look at the buildings itself, I mean, it's an indication of something of yourself, not just of Lewerentz. So when you zoom in on the openings, which and then there's the discussion of the light as a sculpted substance. It's all. It seems like it's, in a sense, you are keyed into this notion of the building. I guess it's the building only appearing in its materiality, not as an object. I mean, there is today now we have through social media, buildings circulate through social media, and they have to be charismatic as images, and they aren't presented typically in this kind of pensive, immersive relationship in the film as you present it. Anyway, I think that somehow you capture some of those qualities that people described in the movie that maybe Lewerentz was hoping that you would discover.
We don't know what he.
No, we don't know. We can speculate because we all make up who we think he was. I wonder if there are there questions or thoughts in the audience that people would. Here's someone. Oh, I'm blinded.
Hi, it was really fantastic film, and I think we should ask you, as a filmmaker, because there are a lot of architectural, thoughts and nuances, but you had a lot of material and assumptions, and then you crafted something, and like you actually paraphrase, the narrator is paraphrasing at the end, that what's striking is that this person, even though is quite old, has lived a long life, is still entering yet another phase of exploration, which was the chair, right? And it occurred to me that one of the striking things about the film is you juxtapose the very large scale of the landscape, right? And of course it's vast. It's a kind of intentionally monumental, the landscape. And then there's the scale of the churches, which are this intimacy and the little details, very small details of the obsessively frameless window, right? And then down to the scale of the chair in the end, and the relationship to the body, which is failing even with the younger character. But I think one of the things that was powerful for me was the steps, because this really subtle idea that it would be basically a forced, exaggerated perspective, right? Because if the steps are getting smaller as they go up, then it will appear to be even further, right? And yet, paradoxically easier to climb as you progress to the top, And that sort of, you put that towards the beginning of the film, right? I mean, it's chronological, I guess, in somewhat in terms of the works, but were there other things as a filmmaker you were trying to juxtapose or give some relief? For example, the horizon line, finally we get to go outside and then we're inside, et cetera.
Not that directly, but what you're saying is really capturing an important part, I think, about architecture and about Lewerentz. Both he's going from the small to the big, and and that the body and the experience as the person that's moving around is a part of the architecture. And someone told me he was really thinking about how to create the handhold for the door, because that's touching, and then you start to feel, and then you open the door, and then the next story begins. And I mean, if you don't know how this will feel, then if you don't have control of that one, you can't control the next room you're entering. And I think that's the same with the steps and with the dark, and how do you sit in the chair, and everything can be controlled. Or he was trying to, and I think it's a part of the film as well that he was really into, try to understand how people feel when they're walking up or going in or going out.
You tracked along when Carolyn Constant was talking about the entrance to South Chapel, Resurrection Chapel. She talked about that subtle pyramid, the way it would feel. You can't really see it. You feel it in the way when you stride across it, you will feel it in your body, but not see it with your eyes, I think. And then you show that as she's describing it.
Another example is in St. Peter's Church. The ground is irregular. It's not flat. And walking towards the baptismal font where the shell is, there's a elevation, and then you fall, so that in a way it takes you there, and without you realizing, you are not really on flat ground, no? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But you capture that. I guess your comment is also to what extent cinematically that the spirit of that haptic experience is transmitted in the film. No, it's a very interesting thing. How I mean, are other films that you have done, other documentaries? I think you've done something about your grandfather. You've done about your grandmother also. Was there a similar immersion in their interiority in those other documentaries you did about your relative? Your grandfather was a prominent architect, no?
Yeah, about the architect, my grandfather, there are connections, of course, how to experience architecture, and how the architecture will be the combination between the human of the architect and the architecture. So. But I think I'm trying to make different films and try to find different ways to present stories. But on the other hand, I'm trying to leave it a bit open for the audience, to make it a bit open to make yourself thinking and start to reflect.
I'm curious if you thought about you didn't dwell on it, but it was at the beginning of the movie, but the instigating sequence of events that shaped Lewerentz's life was the relationship with Asplund. And Asplund was a dandy, and Lewerentz was a introvert of some sort. Do you think, have you thought at all about whether or not that is reflected in Asplund's work? Do you think that that you can divvy up the impact of the two architects, either at Woodland or as their careers diverge?
He died kind of soon after the final main chapel that you saw in the film, so he was not living very long after. Mm-hmm. But I can't really answer your question about that.
Yeah. Okay. Because he does have the courts, and I mean there's several other. Anyway, okay.
In this letter that is very shortly presented in the film that Lewerentz is writing to Asplund, he's saying, if you are taking this by yourself, it's gonna be too much hard work for you, and you will not survive this. And it was actually really hard work and a lot of work, and he was also a bit sick, so he didn't survive really. Mm-hmm. It's a really tragic story, and it's really sad because Asplund, I think he wanted to have the company, but it was not possible. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Are there other questions from the audience? Yes. Here. Oh.
Hi, hi. I just want to say it's a really beautiful film. But I do have a question that since the film mentioned that the darkness is a big part of his design, I wonder if there is a diagram or sketch that can explain that how he used the relationship between darkness and light to drive the design of the church.
There are lots of sketches. I'm not really good at reading sketches because I'm not an architect, but what I guess he had really a lot of ideas about how to control all the light and the darkness as well. Maybe any of you know more details about that?
No, well, I just know, for example, in the main chapel, the catafalque, where the stone where the coffin rests. I mean, there's darkness around it, but the light is perfectly calculated that the beam of light illuminates the catafalque. And it is really stunning, This isn't random. And he calculated it at the hour that usually those rituals take place, So all the orientation. And Robert, you were mentioning that in the early stages, his buildings are more classical. I think even in that neoclassical columns, that seems very traditional, I think even there are codes that are broken because that unit that has the columns, there's a gap between them and the building, It's not aligned in a traditional way, as if that is slightly rotated or
slightly
something.
rotated.
No, there's something strange about it.
It was not really the traditional way of doing anything at all.
No.
And this church you're talking about, it's also a specific time. It's like one light coming from there and one from the roof, and
Yes.
it's making a crucifix on the floor exactly how the priest should enter the floor and standing in the middle of the crucifix then the voice will be perfect for him to see everyone in the church.
Yeah.
So he has planned all details, and it's when someone told you about this, it's really magic.
It's incredible. And this brings me to a point also in terms of his character. For all he did not participate in the public housing projects that were happening, I mean, not just tall buildings. At that time, Sweden was very progressively trying to address issues of housing, issues of public resources, and he refused to participate, he refused to sign any petitions, and yet I think he's an architect of resistance. He did manifest his resistance in his manner of working. He did manifest his resistance in his youth. Apparently, there was more political participation, political engagement. But something happened later in his career through disillusionment, I think, that he dissociated from resisting against institutions and created another system of resistance through his work with the materials, in the materiality. But definitely he was very engaged in the process of resisting conventions, no?
Just one thing, going back to the South Chapel for a moment, actually, also very much like Gunnar Asplund's, the chapel, the smaller chapel that has the lago on top, they're very situated in the landscape, and the loggia is oriented towards the axis that comes up from the knoll that has the stairs rising, and then the chapel itself is off by, I don't know, a degree or two, and it dissolves in a way these elements into the landscape rather than the artifact of the building being a separate object within the landscape. And when you look at you showed us in one of the early images, you see the drawings for the competition, which are all of dark and shadowy forested scenes. I have to say, I owe a lot of my understanding to Woodland Cemetery, to Carolyn Constant, whose very short book is a brilliant, I think, analysis of the two of their contributions to that design. But she talks a lot about the rootedness of the early proposition in the sensibility of a Nordic atmosphere, Nordic neoclassicism, and the idea of the pine forest and primeval atmospheres, which I'm not sure that I want to necessarily draw the line to what we were talking about in terms of atmosphere in the later work, but there were things that have, that fall a little bit into almost what you might think of as an art historical genealogy of sensibility as well. But I certainly agree with this characterization of Lewerentz as resistant. But one of the things that he seems to be resistant to also is the impact of what you might think of as the protocols of modernization. I mean, one of the things that, if you learn about modern architecture in North America, you tend to have seen it in the flesh in North America always as something which is a product of, a well-established industrial culture. But when you go to see the works of modernist architects in Europe, they were almost all building things that looked modernist prior to the advent of the circumstances which they were anticipating. There wasn't that kind of established industry of windows which Lewerentz actually developed himself, but strangely, utilized in his highly customized late works. But part of his resistance is to, it seems to me, to that transformation of the material world. And what's appealing about him is that resistance, and what is, I guess, peculiar with regard to the project that we typically associate with modernist architecture is his unwillingness to participate. So you have institutional, personal, and in much broader historical terms as well. I think, but you had a question there. Get a mic over here.
Hello. Okay, Sven, thank you very much for a compelling film. There are so many layers to it that, but I'm going to focus away from the extraordinary architecture work and comment and ask about the relationship between the two men. It seems obvious to me it's sort of a father-son relationship and of course for men, relationship with her father is very important, and often it's a very difficult one, and fathers being the most important models in a man's life, we yearn for this profound connection and approval from our fathers. And I think, as our psychoanalyst panelists mentioned, that Nyberg was almost wanting to stalk and possess this older man who's sort of this hero figure. And I'm wondering whether, Sven, in your research, you've had a chance to read any diaries or memoirs of Nyberg to get an insight into his background and his relationship with Lewerentz. And the other thing that occurred to me was that often our heroes' figures are kind of sad figures in some ways, tragic figures, because although we yearn to connect with them, they're always ahead of us, working on their own things, in Lewerentz's case, his projects. So it's very difficult to connect with them as peers. They're always half looking elsewhere. And although they were collaborating, Lewerentz was half, in his own world. And I'm wondering whether from from the personal perspective, not an architect's perspective, whether we can discuss the human relations and human, I guess, what's the word? Kind of what drives them, and whether. I think that's it. Yeah, I'm losing my track of thought now. Thank you.
I didn't get any notebooks from Bernt Nyberg, and I get information from Mariana Manner that I said before about how he was, and of course, as I said as well, he was really fascinated by Lewerentz, and he was coming with something they were maybe looking for, but he was one step ahead or something, like going to the material more than just prefabrication and the modernity, or maybe he was modern, but not modern in the same way as modernism.
Bernt was?
Lewerentz, I would say,
Oh,
yeah.
okay, I love that.
So, yeah, I don't have the deeper knowledge about Bernt Nyberg than more than from interviews, I would say.
Yeah, no, it's hard to characterize because, Johan, the historian, focused more on the intensity of that relationship in terms of how Nyberg was really creating the whole cult of him. And I reflected, he really put him in a black box, if you think about it, He locked him into this black box and gave him everything he needed. Almost he created a world for him, an ideal womb-like world where he ushered him to his death. He died in 75 and Nyberg died in 78, so it was almost like apotheosis of both deaths almost happening in conjunction, So there's something of a fusion, I think, that happened or that Nyberg wanted to create through a form of over-identification with him. It's also interesting, one of the really interesting buildings that Nyberg he did some interesting architecture, but one that's well known is an archival building. No, it's the Lund Provincial Archives or some sort of building of archives. So he had a thing with archives, obviously. He had a thing with history, and so did Lewerentz. If you have visited the Woodlands Cemetery, a very prominent object that he designed is a clock. There is a clock, and it appears in the documentary. There's a round clock there. It really struck me when I was there, a clock in a cemetery. It's like, okay, come on, let's keep time, no? At the same time that he took forever to design it, no? So what a contradiction in terms of the time. And I think Nyberg entered into that paradigm of timelessness with him. No?
If he took enough time, he could postpone the striking of the hour.
Yes. It's a beautiful clock, by the way, standing on a bent pipe like those lights.
There was a question over there.
Hello, hi Sven. I just wanted to add a personal note and say thank you so much for this film. My sister and I here, both architects, got to grow up twice in Sweden, in Malmö. Once near the cemetery, and second time near the opera house. So seeing this film the second time as architects now, and understanding the background to it and how you've really portrayed his inner world through the architecture speaks deeply to us. as well as now we have our Swedish grandmother buried right over there. So it's very kind of emotional to us. I suppose my question to you as a filmmaker, does the narrative of this artist unfold as you study his material, or did you have a preset ideas or stories that you had to stitch together? So, sort of, what's your process? Is my question.
I'm not the person that have this idea before doing the film. I don't do the manuscript. I do it along the way. But what I know for sure that I really want to get closer to him by using the archive and try to find out things from the archive. And while listening to the archive, I understood that he's not the person that answering questions really, so I couldn't get closer by just question and answers to him. But what I get closer to was like the personality of him, I would say. And that was, I think, more interesting in a way, because that was also letting me to how to enter the rooms and how to make the film, so connect his personality with how to see the rooms and the architecture. So I was a bit disappointed in the beginning that he was not answering questions, but in the end it was the best way, I think.
Yes.
Thank you.
Hi, Sven. Thank you for the film. It was quite touching. I find that he creates atmospheres and places for us all to go on a journey. So he doesn't take up space, but he creates a space for us to be in it in a safe way. And you mentioned that in one scene, where it creates a psychological safety for us to just sit there and feel comforted in the darkness, where nothing else comes into play with us. And I'm thinking maybe he took the time away from all the other projects to give himself that space to just be and work on what he was, the glass works and so forth, and then he comes back. But he keeps himself he's sort of in the dark and by himself and not talking to too many other people, so as to create that safe space for himself too, so he can be himself. And everybody seems to be on the journey of capturing his essence, and it's always escaping us, and it keeps us on the journey to keep searching, and perhaps we can learn something about ourselves or about the dynamic of life and time and so forth. But it was quite touching. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Over here? Oh, there's one over there.
So I'm curious how you found the brick mason who did the Klippen Church in 1965. How are you able to locate him after all these years?
About what? Sorry,
The bricklayer, the mason, who you
he's-
interviewed. How did you manage to find him after?
The good thing with
40
making
years.
documentaries, it takes a long time to make them. And actually, I heard about him, and he had a really hard time with cancer. So I had to wait 2 years before he was retreated and was able to walk again. So now he's very fine. And all these people, of course, it's amazing to have seen them. And 2 of them have actually been gone since I met them. So I want to do more interviews with 2 of these people, but they died because of age, I think, during my process. So that's how it is, and a lot of time that is important in filmmaking, I would say. And the process of understanding the subject, but also finding people or finding picture of someone that doesn't want to be in pictures takes some time as well.
Anyone else? Okay. Well, I want to thank you both Sven, thank you so much for the film. It really brought those buildings and those lives to life for us. It's beautiful.
Thank you very much.
And thank you, David, for your insights as well. Before you all go, if I may, I just want to remind you that we do have more events, and in our public programming series next week, there's a lecture performance by the London-based practice cooking sections, established in 2013 by Daniel Fernandez Pascual and Alain Schwab. Cooking sections uses food as both a lens and a tool to examine landscapes and transformation, and the lecture will be called Common Mud and Flooded Pits. So we'll be here. I don't know why. Somehow common mud, bricks, they somehow belong together. Anyway, next Tuesday at 6:30 p.m., you're all welcome to come. Register ahead of time if you can. And I hope to see you again either there or at other events. And thank you for joining us tonight. And once more, Sven, thank you so much.